Welcome to lesson number 3 in our series on the parables of Jesus. Today we look at the parable of the unforgiving servant based on Matthew 18 verses 21 to 35. Just a quick reminder that we have a Bible study that meets, if you're watching this kind of in real time, we have a Bible study that meets on Wednesday nights at 5:30 at Cleveland First United Methodist Church, located at 318 South Court Street, and everybody's invited to come and join us. I'm pleased and happy to be able to do these video lessons. The lesson in person has a little bit more of back and forth and discussion. In fact, a lot of the things that I had already written out to look at and explore were questions that came up even before I got to them, questions that came up in the midst of our discussion, and a great discussion we had last night. So if you're not able to come in person, I'm so thankful that you are here and that you hopefully are getting something out of these lessons. If you're able to come in person, you still get the same content, but you get the other discussion and insight as well. So if you're able to come in person, I invite you to come and join us. Jesus, in talking about this parable, tells it in response to a question that came from Peter. The question is this: how often should I forgive? Now, it's a good question to explore, even when we know what the correct answer is. And one of the things that we'll see in the midst of the question, and before Jesus tells the parable, is that Peter thinks he knows what the correct answer is, but he doesn't really understand the nature of that forgiveness. So let's look then at Matthew 18, verses 21 to 35. Peter came to him and said, "Lord, if my brother or sister sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but 77 times. And of course, some versions say 70 times 7. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and as he could not pay, the Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children, and all of his possession, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him and said, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he says, 'Pay what you owe.' Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' But he refused, and then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their Lord all that had taken place. Then the Lord summoned him and said, 'You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?' And in his anger, the Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his debt. So my heavenly Father will do with every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." We're thankful for the reading and the hearing and the receiving into our hearts this God's holy word. Now, I would encourage you, if you'd like to do this, to pause for a moment and maybe pause the video and maybe even write down a couple of insights, a couple of questions that come. Maybe there was a word or phrase or something you'd not heard before that you heard as I read it this time, and maybe take a few moments and kind of think about what some of those things might be, kind of as prep as we go throughout the rest of this lesson. So before we get into the parable itself, there's one thing to look at, is that, and we're going to talk about that forgiveness and how Peter understood forgiveness. But notice that when Jesus starts the parable, he says the kingdom of heaven may be compared to. And so right off the bat, Jesus is telling us that it is cluing us in as to the nature of the kingdom of heaven and our relationship with God, but then also in our relationship with each other. The parable comes in response to the question, how often should I forgive? Now, the law of Moses says 3 times, so Peter thinks he's been very gracious with 7 times. I mean, that's twice plus 1. In other words, Peter's thinking to himself, I'm going the extra length. I'm being especially merciful. and gracious. So it must have surprised him when Jesus says not 7 times, but 77 times, or 70 times 7. And of course, that number is not that you keep track and go, okay, now I'm on forgiveness number 15 or whatever. It's a continual, eternal type of forgiveness. And he gives us this parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to this. There's a slave who owes a king 10,000 talents. Now, right off the bat, the people of that day would have understood what Jesus was doing, and that he's giving this just kind of crazy number, that amount that the slave owed. A talent was equivalent to 15 years of wages. The slave owes the king 10,000 talents. In other words, the slave owes the king 150,000 years of wages. And so right off the bat, the people of that day would have understood that Jesus is giving this just incredible number, using exaggeration, using hyperbole to start making this point of an unpayable debt. It would be as if I started a parable by saying, I owed my best friend $2 billion. And unless my best friend is Elon Musk or Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or Jeff Bezos or somebody like that, my next door neighbor, I owed my next door neighbor $2 billion. Right off the bat, that's not a real number. It's meant to signify something that's just even beyond the realm of imagination. But it's to get them to think about and to realize their relationship to God in terms of what we owe God due to the depth of our own sin. And just to kind of highlight that, the amount of taxes in the area of Judea up to Galilee, that's Jerusalem all the way up to Galilee, the amount of taxes in a given year was only 800 talents a year. So 10,000 was more than 10 years of the entire taxes in a region. More than any one person would have ever been able to have, much less a slave who is beholden to a master. And so it's not only unpayable, there's no way, and it's so far beyond the realm of reason that it's meant to just signify basically that there is no real comparison in our relationship with the depth of our sin. The depth of our sin in relationship to God's justice and mercy is as great or greater even than 150,000 years of wages. In other words, there's no way that we could ever make up, nothing we could ever do that could properly compensate for what it is we owe God in the midst of that. So the slave begs for forgiveness, or he at least he begs for time, and says, "I will try to repay you." And the king, in his pity, forgives the debt. So that message is very clear, isn't it? Like that king, like that slave who owed the king an unpayable debt, we too owe God an unpayable debt. There's no way that we can begin to offer God anything that comes remotely close to paying back to God what it is that God has done for us. And of course, the beauty of it is that God doesn't ask us to do it anyway. We're reminded through this parable and through other teachings that we have not acted responsibly. We have not deserved to be set free from our debt. There's nothing that we can do or have done. Rather, we owe that unpayable debt to God because of our sin and our rebellion against Him. But because of God's grace and mercy, because of God's grace and mercy, and by no other means, God has forgiven us that unpayable debt, has released us, has freed us, and invites us to be restored in that relationship. Notice there's no payment plan or anything. There's no list to the slave, if you'll do these 5 things. The Lord has pity. The Master has pity. God looks on us and has pity for us. And out of that pity and that desire for us to be with Him, He came in the flesh, sent His very Son, to forgive us our debt. But just as there's a word of grace, there's a word of warning as well, because the parable doesn't end there, does it? Jesus talks about this, what we call this vertical relationship with us and God, between us and God in the kingdom of heaven. But now he talks about this horizontal relationship between us and our neighbor. The same man who's just been forgiven an unpayable debt, 150,000 years of wages, won't forgive a debt of 100 denarii. A denarii was equivalent to a day's wage for a common laborer. 150,000 years versus 100 days. And this lack of forgiveness on the part of this slave who's just been forgiven recognizes that this slave didn't learn a thing. He'd had no sense of gratitude. He had no sense of the magnitude of what had happened. He just knew that he was now free. And he wasn't concerned about anybody else. He had no compassion for anybody else like the king, like the master had for him. All he knows is, I've got what's mine. I'm good. I don't care whatever happens to anybody else. And in fact, if I have to impoverish somebody else to get what I have, it doesn't matter, even though this act of generosity and kindness and pity has been offered to me. You see, the circumstances have changed, but his heart has not. So I want you to think about, maybe pause and write down, but just think about these questions and reflect upon this. How are we sometimes like that servant who wouldn't forgive the debt? How are we sometimes in our relationships with others? And then just to ask that question, why is it that the slave finds it so hard to forgive in the first place? And to make it more personal, why is it so hard for us sometimes to forgive someone else? Even when we know, in our head at least, that we've been totally forgiven by God for what we have done. I'll try to answer it to some extent. And again, remember, people have been writing about these things. People have written books, volumes of books about forgiveness. So we're not going to be able to cover everything in every situation and every circumstance and in every detail and nuance in this time. But I think part of that heart, and when we have been forgiven by God and we're more than willing to accept that, but we're not willing to forgive somebody else, is that sometimes I think we fail to see the depth of our own sin, while at the same time we are more than willing to see the depth of somebody else's sin. I think it's oftentimes easier for us to try to justify our own sin, to explain away our own sin, the harm that we might have done to somebody else, because we're kind of tempted to give ourselves most of the time the benefit of the doubt. We all have times we beat up on ourselves, but to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, because I know I'm a good person. And I just messed up. I did something wrong. I made a mistake. But I'm a good person. I would never willingly try to do that. But that person over there, now they're just a bad person. Somebody said last night, they're just a snake. There's no good in them. And so whatever I did, even though I did wrong and I have to confess it, I know it was out of my good heart. But them, they're just bad. They have no goodness in their heart. They're just evil and manipulative. It's easy for us to ascribe sinister motives to other people that we would never ascribe to ourselves. And we're willing to and try to examine what it is that might have led us to do what we did. But we fail to look at the circumstances and the hurt of somebody else to maybe try to understand why they did what they did. It's also hard to forgive because when some harm is done to us, our first instinct is to lash out. It's to respond in kind. There was and I wish I'd seen it last night, but there was a statement that got passed around on Facebook by a lot of people I know, and it says, if you speak when you are angry, you will make the best speech you will ever regret. You ever made any of those speeches? I know I've made some speeches where I lashed out. I didn't take that measure. I didn't seek to understand. I didn't try to put myself in the shoes of another person. I was just angry. I was upset. I was hurt. And in that immediacy, I lashed out instead of seeking to try to forgive. Well, then, what does it mean really to forgive then? Does forgiving mean forgetting? Like we literally, it just goes out of our mind? I've heard people say that. You just don't even remember that it happened anymore. Well, I'll say I hope that that's not forgiveness because there's certainly things that I remember that were done to me. And I remember the people who did them to me. But in forgiving somebody, it's not that it totally goes out of your mind that you don't even remember it. But in forgiving, what forgiveness means is that you are deciding that you will no longer hold that offense against another person. Or if you're the one who did the offense, they will no longer hold that offense against you. And again, it's hard because when we're truly hurt, we tend to react out of doing harm of our own. Whereas forgiveness involves not speaking in anger. Forgiveness involves choosing not to respond in kind and to break that cycle of hurt to where you have the opportunity, but you decide not to hurt the other person, or you just decide to let it go. Somebody talks about a situation or a person living rent-free in your head. Have you ever heard that phrase? I know there are people who, for periods of time, have lived rent-free in my head. I've woken up in the middle of the night, and I may not have gone to sleep thinking about them, but I wake up in the middle of the night, and I can't go back to sleep because I'm imagining all of these conversations. And sometimes these conversations happen years or even decades ago. Sometimes they're recent. But that living rent-free, it's there. You stew on it. You don't want to let it go. And honestly, sometimes we don't want to let it go because it feels like if we do let go, then somehow maybe we're condoning it. Somehow they're not getting what they deserve. And so we think sometimes in our own mind and heart that not forgiving is punishing them. And that not forgiving is not condoning what they did, whereas sometimes forgiving somebody feels like, well, it almost feels like in our heart what you're saying is that it's okay. And by no means is forgiveness ever saying that what was done was okay. What it's saying is that you refuse to allow that to dominate your mind and heart. You refuse to allow that. Potentially, if that person comes and asks, especially if that person comes and asks you for forgiveness, then potentially you're not allowing that thing to be an impediment in a future relationship. If there's no reciprocity back and forth, there's no reconciliation that takes two people, it may be, and especially if it's something that happened a while back and you may not even be around that person anymore, or that relationship is damaged and they're not interested in healing it, forgiveness is something you can do on your own. You don't have to go to talk to that person. It's something you can do in your own heart, and in fact, you kind of have to do that in your own heart to let it go. But however the circumstance of how that happens, at its heart, forgiveness is choosing not to respond to someone else the way they responded to you. It's choosing to not allow that hurt to continue to fester and be there and be that wound. It's forgiveness is letting go of that hurt and moving beyond that hurt. I heard it put one time that holding on to that grudge or holding on to that anger, that refusal to forgive is like taking poison and expecting the other person to die. Because sometimes when we fail to forgive because we feel like we're letting them off the hook or we're condoning what they did or that they deserve whatever punishment is, we think we're punishing them and they may not even have any idea or they may not care. But we're damaged. Our heart is damaged. We take the poison and we expect the other person to get sick. But all it's doing is hurting us. And even if it's hurting, that lack of forgiveness is hurtful to the other person, it still does nothing good for us. If we're going to be in relationship with one another, and God tells us in relationship with Him, we have to be willing to let go of that hurt and not hold a grudge against someone who has done us harm. And why? Because it is what God has done for us. And remember, Jesus says the kingdom of heaven may be compared to this. The kingdom of heaven, you see, is about forgiveness, and it's about grace, and it's about mercy. Forgiving someone else recognizes, one, that you have been forgiven, and that God has forgiven you an unpayable debt. And so if God has forgiven you that, then why can't you forgive someone else? And again, I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying that it happens right away. But we have to be in that process. We need to be working toward that instead of holding on to it. Now, I kind of touched on it a minute ago, but forgiveness does not mean that we forget what happened. And depending on the offense and depending on the response of the other person, that relationship with that other person may be beyond repair, especially if that person refuses to acknowledge that they've done any harm at all. And that's just part of the nature of how that works. And this is where we kind of get into nuance and circumstances. I would never try to pretend to put just kind of a blanket statement upon every particular relationship and circumstance and hurt excuse me, that you've had in your life, because sometimes it's a minor thing and sometimes it is deeply hurtful. It gets us to the core of who we are. Sometimes we forgive people who have harmed us, but we aren't particularly close with them, and sometimes it's the most important people in our lives who have hurt us the most, and we struggle with that as well. Forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship has to be restored. And again, especially if that person refuses to do harm. You can forgive and at the same time not put yourself back in the position to be hurt again. Particularly if there's been some sort of emotional or spiritual or mental or physical abuse. You can forgive that person, but you don't need to put yourself back in a circumstance to allow yourself to be hurt again in the midst of that. But we are called to do that hard work of forgiving someone else. Because again, in forgiving somebody else, we recognize the depth of our own sin. Back when I was in Philadelphia, I had the opportunity, I felt God calling me to participate in a prison ministry that was going on at the local jail there. And I really hesitated for several months, and I really kept finding excuses. I just kept telling God I'm not going to do it. And over and over again, God kept bringing it back up in books I read and articles and other situations and people I would talk to. And finally, I said, God, if you'll just leave me alone, I'll go talk with the person who runs the jail ministry. He's not going to want me anyway, but I'll go talk to him. And one of my concerns was that in my life, I've never been, as somebody asked me one time, in real trouble. When I was going through my ordination process, I had a minister smile and look at me. He knew my dad. He knew my situation. He said, have you ever been in real trouble? And I said, well, I've had some close scrapes, and I've broken curfew a few times. I've done some things my parents didn't know about. And he said, that's not what I'm talking about. And I said, I know. No, I've never been in real trouble. Not in that type of way that he was getting at. And I thought, how am I? Why would these people listen in the jail listen to me? I've never been in real trouble. I grew up in about as ideal a circumstance as you can have, with loving parents, with a great loving family, siblings, extended family, good friends, nice neighborhood, all those types of things. I grew up with all those types of positives and those advantages, and I raised my kids in that same way. Why in the world would they listen to me? But in the midst of all that, one of the things that God showed me was that was part of the arrogance of my own heart. Because basically what I was saying was, why would they listen to me when I haven't ever really done anything wrong? And I had to take that time and examine my own arrogance. And to recognize and to admit and to confess that even though my sin may not have had the same temporal consequences, they may not have had the same harm against a physical harm against somebody else. It may not have been that same type of dynamic as somebody who ends up in prison. My sin is just as offensive to God as theirs is. And that God has forgiven me when I don't deserve to be forgiven. He's forgiven me by His grace and mercy. Because even though I may not have done those outward things, God knows my own heart. He knows where I struggle. He knows some bitterness that I hold on to and I work to release. He knows those circumstances. He knows those places where I'm vulnerable. So it was just sheer arrogance on my part to somehow pretend that I was better than these other folks. I'm no better in the eyes of God than anybody else. I'm a sinner who has received the grace and mercy of God, who's called to offer that to others. So you see, when we do that work of forgiveness, we have to not only look at what the other person did to us, we have to look at our own heart and realize that we are here only because of the extreme grace and mercy shown by Jesus Christ, when on the cross He said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." God offers each of us forgiveness, not because we're great, fine, upstanding people, not because of any earthly reputation we may have, but because God is gracious and loving and merciful. So you see, ultimately, the forgiveness of sins and us forgiving somebody else tells us or demonstrates that we have at least some understanding of the forgiveness that God showed to us through Jesus Christ. And out of that extreme mercy and grace, we can then forgive others as Christ forgave us. Ultimately, if we refuse to accept the forgiveness of sins, and if we refuse to forgive others their sins, we are the ones who are most harmed by that hard heart and by that lack of mercy. Ultimately, a lack of forgiveness leads to a lack of understanding of the depth of God's love in our own life. A lack of forgiveness means that we fail to acknowledge our own sin. A lack of forgiveness ultimately corrodes our own soul and moves us farther away from God. But when we are able to forgive one another in these temporal relationships, it helps us grow closer to understanding and being part of the kingdom of heaven. A heaven that is a state of being, a state of being that is marked by grace and mercy and love. I'm only here today proclaiming the forgiveness of sins and urging the forgiveness of sins and talking about the importance of the forgiveness of sins, because in my life, God has forgiven me. God has forgiven each one of us an unpayable debt that we owe due to our rebellion. And only when we understand how much we truly have been forgiven can we then forgive others who trespass against us. And that is the key, you see, in our forgiving of others. We have been forgiven even though we didn't deserve it. And so we need to forgive others whether or not we think they deserve it. The parable ultimately forces us to look at the nature of forgiveness, which means it forces us to look at how we see our salvation in Christ. Do we see that salvation in Christ as a transforming experience that teaches us day by day about the loving nature of God? Or do we see, as the slave did, that mercy and forgiveness as kind of a fire insurance? Something that we happen to do, something that gets us off the hook, but we fail to understand what that truly means. In those circumstances, just as with that slave who refused to forgive the debt, our heart is not changed. There is no real gratitude, and any foundation is just shallow to be wiped away. God calls us to look at all that we have been given, all that we have been forgiving for, all that we have done that is offensive to God, and out of God's mercy for us, have that mercy of forgiveness towards others. The word of hope is that we can forgive others because of what God has done for us. The word of warning is that if we fail to understand that, then we can't really experience forgiveness of God because we don't understand what God did in the first place. There's a famous public figure who years ago was asked about faith. And they asked, have you ever confessed your sin? He was talking about, they were asking him if he was a Christian. He's never really gone to church. And they asked him if he has ever asked for forgiveness. And he said, I've never done anything I need to ask forgiveness for. Well, that heart is not one that really understands grace. It doesn't understand love. It doesn't understand what it means to have mercy for another person. And he certainly doesn't understand what God has done for him. And in that lack of understanding what God has done for us, if we fail to understand that, then we fail to understand how we relate to each other. We can forgive, and we are called to forgive because God forgave us in Jesus Christ. So, part of your homework this week would be to say, who are you struggling to forgive? Why is it that you're having difficulty? You might have been able to forgive somebody else fairly easily for something else, but you're having trouble here. Why is it that you're having trouble here? To examine that, to look at that. Is there a particular harm? Is it the severity of it? Is it a place of vulnerability for you? Who do you need to forgive? Who might you have trouble forgiving right now? Who do you need to offer that up to God? To do that work, to think about what it is that God has done for you, to start to do that work in your forgiveness of others. I hope that you will do that. And I hope that day by day you move towards being that forgiving person who has, in response to being forgiven by our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that there is something in here that has been helpful and has made you kind of think and reflect in this week ahead. Thank you for joining me, and God bless you and have a wonderful day.